But tonight you are here for After Dark, My Sweet. And this is a 35 millimeter print that is no longer in active circulation. It comes from a private collection. It's in nice shape, but it is as with many 35 prints, tails and ends are going to be a little bit dirty. There'll be some scratches, but the colors are nice, and this is a really unique opportunity, and I'm very glad that you're here to share that with us, especially since we have a very uniquely qualified person to do an introduction to this film. Bruce Kawin was actually the man who, when I was here, a student in the late 80s here at CU, I was a humanities major, and part of being a humanities major was taking classes in all these other different disciplines, and one of them was film. And Bruce Kawin was my portal to film studies, and he's the reason I decided to become a film major. And he is also a Jim Thompson scholar who taught classes on Jim Thompson, the author whose movie this is based on. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Bruce Kawin. Thank you for joining us tonight, sir.
Okay, your glasses are here, by the way. Always finding people's glasses. So, Jim Thompson was a writer from Oklahoma. Has anyone ever read any of his books? Right. Okay, well, his books are short, violent, disturbing, about very often disturbed people with a tremendous amount of speed, is all I can tell you. Emotional, psychological action, speed. He's often compared with Cornell Woolrich and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and David Goodis, but he's better. He's compared to Hemingway, and he's much better. If you just start reading this man's work, and you will read all 29 of the novels, which I did very quickly. I was involved in a movie called The Grifters, which was, as far as we knew, the first Thompson adaptation to use one of his actual endings. Then it turned out that After Dark, My Sweet came out 4 months before The Grifters. They started it later and came out faster because we had some troubles with who was going to be the final writer, who's the final director. The producer, Scorsese, was busy shooting something called Bad for Michael Jackson. And we all had to wait for a while. But I started that script in 1987. And it was finished by a guy named Donald Westlake, who was famous for adapting The Stepfather, and who certainly knew his business. But the thing about Thompson's books, they really do have unfilmable endings. And just to give you a rough idea, there was quite a good one called The Getaway that was directed by Peckinpah, and Steve McQueen, and Walter Hill produced, and those are powerful people, and they couldn't get the novel's ending into that story. The characters pull off a robbery, they escape to Mexico, they get over the border, movie ends. Novel gets them to where they're going in Mexico, and it's hell. It's one of the most vivid descriptions of hell you may ever read. Beats Dante. It's very short, really scary, and that's how it ends. He did have some connections with the film industry. He wrote most of 2 Kubrick films, one called The Killing, which has a very complicated narrative structure, really interesting, and the other, Paths of Glory. Kubrick took the credits for both of them, gave Thompson additional dialogue credit on Paths of Glory, but Kubrick did something for him, which he wrote this sentence. Speaking of The Killer Inside Me, which is Thompson's greatest book, take my word for it, probably the most chilling and believable first-person story of a criminally warped mind I have ever encountered. So it was fair. He took the credits, but he said that, and it's true. The Killer Inside Me is the most extraordinary of its kind. If you want to read Thompson, just start out with him, start with that one. Go to Savage Night, which is the most extreme. From there, the funny one is Pop 1280. It was adapted into a rather bad one called Coup de Torchon that changed the ending. He took the ending from Killer Inside Me and stuck it onto Pop 1280. Terrible move. And then the one that's really impossible to make a film out of it, and they did it, called The Hell of a Woman. You will be seeing Série Noire, which is the French version of that amazing novel, at the end of this series, right? Several months. So you get some time to read him, okay? And those are the 4 novels I would recommend, like, right away. After Dark, My Sweet, and The Grifters, and The Getaway are like next level down of the novels. But The Killer Inside Me, Savage Night, Pop 1280, and A Hell of a Woman are as good as American literature gets after Moby Dick. And I used to teach this stuff, okay? So I'm going a little overboard, but if you find this guy is your writer, you will be glad I said it to you, okay? So he started writing stories when he was about 14. He sold to the men's magazines like Saga. He edited one of those magazines. He ran the Oklahoma Writers Project for 9 years. He did odd jobs, which he wrote about. Like, for example, he was a bellboy in some hotel where he was the kid who would get you liquor during the Depression and the Prohibition, and you'd get prostitutes of whatever variety that you needed, and he was like 13, 14. He worked on oil rigs, wrote books about that. He was a professional gambler. He was a grifter. And at some point, he decided he was going to write novels. He was working in an aircraft factory, had a wife and 2 kids. The only thing he had for a desk was a toilet. And that's the core thing for this guy as a writer. Just imagine him with a typewriter on top of a toilet typing away when he's completely exhausted from a hard day's work in a factory, and think what it smells like. That's how he started. It's a book called Now and on Earth, and it's as good as Steinbeck, and it's kind of in that genre. Really amazing stuff. Then he wrote a mystery called Nothing More Than Murder, and then he got a deal with Lion Publishers. This was a paperback house. They put out books for 25 cents, 35 cents if it was very long, and you'd get them in drugstores. And this guy who ran the company hired Thompson, told him to write a book called The Killer Inside Me, because he made up all the titles, this guy. And what are you going to do? He makes up this story, writes it in 4 weeks, gets another one. And he starts doing that, writing paperback originals about once a month while raising a family, getting paid $250 per book, and raising a family on that. There's a moment in Savage Night when the killer narrator is hitching down to New York, and he gets a ride from a guy who was obviously Jim Thompson, who has been growing butts and breasts on a farm in Vermont, and he drives them to the city and sells them for $250, and they get sold for $25, and they decide which of them is going to kill each other before they get to New York. He did things like that. You know, the Faulkner gets credit for things like that. Joyce gets credit for things like that. But Thompson really did it. So anyway, this movie has a script by the producer and the director. My suspicion is that that producer is the brains behind the project, and that things like this start with a script, and you have to pay for it, and then you hire a director. That's kind of how it's often done. Well, clearly, in this case, somebody loved this book and decided to pay for it and hired a very fine director who had just made it close range. And they come up with this. I have only one critique about the film. It's a little bit too sweet, a little lyrical, a little too loving, because they fell for the title, After Dark, My Sweet, which was made up by this publisher who didn't have any idea in mind of a plot. And they fell for it. They decided it should be kind of a sweet ending. So they changed a few words. And it's okay, all right? This one is pretty much what Thompson wrote. It's disturbing, it's sexy, it's violent, it's full of just betrayal after betrayal after betrayal, and it's a love story. And that's the kind of thing he did. So I hope you enjoy it.